Good morning. Our scripture reading today is from the New International Version, Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 33. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on the mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "let me come to you on the water." "Come," he said. When Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
So I'm satisfied that if we don't try real hard, we'll still be able to identify with the experience of these disciples on the boat on the Sea of Galilee. The way the Gospel of Matthew tells it, these disciples are on a boat ride that Jesus sends them on. He wants them alone time. They fed the 5,000 men, not counting the women and children. They've all shared in the miracle. It's been a long day of teaching and preaching and ministering and healing already. And Jesus wants to be alone to pray. So he sends his disciples ahead of him out onto the waters of the Sea of Galilee, where suddenly, out of nowhere, a storm arises. The winds howl. The waters chop. The storm rages all night long. And these already exhausted disciples find themselves bailing water and trying to stay alive in the midst of this howling storm that came out of nowhere. At the fourth watch of the night, that's the middle of the night in Southern Greek translation. It's actually between 3 and 6 a.m. At the point the exhaustion has to be the highest. The vulnerability has to be the greatest. Jesus comes walking to them. Stepping on the storms. Demonstrating his mastery over all the things that have been tormenting them. I'm well satisfied that after the last year and a half or so, we Christians know what it is to battle a storm that came out of nowhere, at least in some regards, and doesn't seem to want to turn loose. Remember how immediately, at least, we felt the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic? I can still remember feeling like the world was changing under my feet in early March of 2020. Remember how fast we had to mobilize to start fighting against that storm. And remember, it didn't take long before we realized that this immediate storm that had come out of nowhere was only making more obvious some storms that had been raging in our world for a lot longer than the coronavirus pandemic. Bitter partisanship, extraordinary racial and economic injustice. All of a sudden, we in the church found ourselves facing a combination of storms. And for a year and a half, we, like those disciples on the Sea of Galilee, have found ourselves trying to figure out what it means to be faithful in the midst of the storm. That's why I say I think we don't have to try very hard to identify with these disciples of Jesus who find themselves on a once tranquil sea, and all of a sudden the waters are rising and the winds are howling and the storm is brutal and the energy is drained and the exhaustion rises. Because I think we know, at least in some measure, what it feels like. We have to give thanks for all the ways during this year and a half that we've seen Jesus coming to us, walking on the waters and stepping on the storms. In the time of testimony we shared around tables this morning in Sunday school, we had the chance to reflect on times during this last year we've experienced the presence of Christ, or we've grown in our faith, or we've learned something along the way. Signs we've seen that even in the midst of unfamiliar territory, the Jesus who walked on the waters of the Sea of Galilee has been stepping on the storms of our lives and our times and our seasons, not leaving us to combat the storms alone, but coming to us, speaking to us the very same words he spoke to those disciples. Take courage. It is I. Fear not. I'm satisfied this morning that I don't have to talk much longer to persuade us that we can identify with the disciples. And I'm even satisfied I don't have to talk much longer to celebrate the good news that Jesus is with us even in the midst of the storms. The question I've come to ask you this morning is, what do you make of Peter? Because this is a place where Baptists have been fighting longer than there were Baptist battles in the American South. This is a place where Christians have been struggling almost since the beginning, because let's just be honest. There is not agreement on what we are to make of what Simon Peter does after Jesus makes his fourth watch of the night appearance. There's one, how shall I put it? There are professors in the room. There's one interpretive school, how's that for sophistication, that says, oh my gosh, Peter is in over his head in more ways than one. You know, Peter is impulsive. Peter doesn't know how to stay in his lane. Peter doesn't know how to stay within the boundaries of his human condition. Maybe what we're seeing here as Peter cries out, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. Maybe what we're seeing is a foretaste of the same kind of bravado that a chapter later is going to cause Simon Peter to tell Jesus that he's got his messianic theology wrong at Caesarea Philippi. Maybe we're seeing the same kind of bravado previewed that's later going to cause Simon Peter to tell Jesus on the last night of Jesus' life that no matter what happens, Peter will never leave him or abandon him, even if it means dying, and about 6 hours later, Peter has disappeared. Maybe we're having a preview of Peter's kind of impulsive, speak without thinking, draw attention to myself kind of personality that leads him to say, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water so I can get some attention. And if so, then what we ought to be saying with a New Testament scholar as respectable as Eugene Boring in the preparation for worship is, Peter, get back in the boat. After all, isn't one of the oldest images of the church that rises out of the New Testament, this notion that the church is the community in the boat on these stormy seas? Doesn't Peter belong in the boat with the other disciples? Shouldn't Peter be waiting in the boat to welcome Jesus into the boat where there can be peace and calm and presence and grace? Why is Peter trying to step out of the boat when he belongs in the boat? Shouldn't he get back in his lane and we can go on to lunch? I have to confess I've come this morning, as any good Baptist should, to take a contrary position. I may not be right. The community can judge. But a question I've been toying with for several decades, and as I'll acknowledge later, not even of my own ingenuity, is what if we're watching Peter begin to discover in real time what it means to really be a follower of Jesus in a stormy time? After all, in defense of Peter, and I've taken on that representation today, in defense of Peter, just hours earlier, Jesus has invited his disciples to share a miracle with him. Jesus doesn't feed the 5,000 people by himself. He invites the disciples to join him. You give them something to eat, he says. Peter and his disciple colleagues literally pass out all the pieces of bread and all the fish that Jesus comes out of the one lunch. Jesus is involved. Peter's involved. James, John, all the disciples have a role to play. They're caught up in the middle of that miracle. Then notice, Peter doesn't just jump out of the boat of his own free will. He asks for permission. And Jesus says to Peter, come. Come. That's the primal word of discipleship, right? Come, follow me. Come, be where I am. Come, share my life. Come, do what I do in the world. Come, step out of your comfort and your familiarity. Come and follow me. Come and step. And so sure enough, Peter hears the invitation, come. And he steps out onto the stormy seas. He puts one foot in front of another. Now, I know somebody's going to say, yeah, see, he falls on his face. Before we shove him overboard, let the moment sit with you for a moment. One foot in front of the other, eyes fixed on Jesus, walking on the choppy waters just as Jesus had, going to meet Jesus where he is. Isn't that what we're all called to do as followers of Jesus? To step out of comfort and convenience and safety and security and take some bold risk to join Jesus where he is, sharing his life of risky redemption. When I watch old Peter walking on those choppy seas, I can't help but think of old Moses, who once got that instruction, can't buy the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds or whatever sea it was. There's an Old Testament scholar in the room, isn't there? Y'all can straighten that out. Yeah, I know. He has to put his foot, Moses does, on the waters as they part. And as Moses and the Israelites walk, the sea parts and they have a way through. As I watch Peter stepping on the storms, I can't help not just think of Moses, but I can't help but thinking about where Peter's going to be not too much later after Jesus' resurrection, as recorded in the book of Acts, where Peter is standing courageously preaching the good news of Jesus to enemy audiences to Jewish authorities, where Peter finds himself doing the very same kind of miracles that Jesus has done during his lifetime, I can't help but notice that what Peter starts practicing on that Sea of Galilee, as he puts one foot in front of the other, is the kind of bold, courageous faith that's going to be required of him and the other disciples after Jesus ascends to heaven and the ministry belongs to them. So I ask you, my sisters and brothers, isn't it possible that what we're witnessing in this text is Peter's first steps toward his mature faith? He's not fully arrived yet. Yes, he's going to get scared. Yes, he's going to lose his focus. But who among us doesn't on our journey of faith? Who among us can say we jumped out of the waters of baptism and we got it right immediately? Who among us can say there's never been a time we didn't need Jesus to reach down and lift us out of those waters? Yes, love lifted me, because thank God none of us can get it right the first time. We need a God who loves us so much and who cares about us so much that even when we are sinking deep and we lose our focus and we lose our trust, there is a Jesus who will lift us back up and then give us the courage to try again. I can't help but wondering as I watch Peter stepping on the storms, if he's not showing us what mature faith looks like on stormy seas. Now, because confession is good for the soul, I should tell you I didn't come up with this on my own. In fact, very little preaching is about that kind of creativity. This idea was planted in my heart at a preaching conference sponsored by the Baptist Theological Seminary at Richmond at the end of the last century. Yes, Chuck Bugg has an excuse not to be here today. I gave him a note so he could go be with his family. But Chuck organized that conference. It was the BTSR preaching conference, 1998, 1999. I was actually a young Baptist then. Yeah. I was like in my 20s. And the headliner for the conference was Fred Craddock. The extra preacher at the conference was a fellow named John Kinney. John was then the dean of the School of Theology at Virginia Union University. A phenomenal black preacher. And this was the text he chose. And he, much more artfully than I, held up the possibility that Peter was not in the wrong. That Peter was modeling what courageous faith should look like. And he held before us this notion that in the personal times of crisis in our lives, we had to choose between staying in the boat and playing it safe, or allowing the same power that enabled Jesus to walk on the waters to lift us and carry us forward. He invited us to consider what it might mean to step on the storms in our personal lives, to step on fear, to step on doubt, to step on addiction, to step on failure, to step on uncertainty, to step on all the things that were undoing us, not in our own strength and in our own power, but instead in the same power that we meet when Jesus comes to us in the middle of the storm. I don't know what the next 12 months will hold for the church in North America. I am not a practicing or recovering futurist pundit. And I have no idea, since I just stopped through today, what kind of storms might be raging in each of your lives. But I have this hunch that we're going to be spending a fair amount of time for the foreseeable future trying to navigate wilder seas. And I have this hunch that in the life of our congregations and in our own life as disciples, the lazy river season is long gone and probably not coming back soon. The good news is we serve a Jesus who is more powerful than any storm that rages in our culture or in our lives. And the good news is even better than that. That Jesus' power is available to us to help lift us out of the things that might paralyze us, to give us a voice with which we can speak, and hands with which we can serve, and feet with which we can walk toward wherever Jesus is serving and loving and living in this world. I think in these days, congregations like Faith will need to be bold and need to be courageous and need to be experimental and need to try on what it looks like to wear the power that lifted Jesus over those waters and raised Jesus from the dead. We won't always get it right. Ask Peter. But when we don't, he's still there to lift us up. I came across a poem recently. Chuck always taught us to end our sermons with poems. No, he actually didn't. So this is not for him. But my colleague Adam and I came across a poem attributed to Francis Drake in the late 16th century. I won't read it all. I'll give you the last stanza because I think Peter would pray this too. Disturb us, Lord, to dare more boldly, to venture on to wilder seas, where storms show your mastery, where losing sight of land, we shall find the stars. We ask you, Lord, to push back the horizons of our hopes and to push into the future and strength, courage, hope, and love. Somewhere before he slips, I think what Peter says to you and me is, come on. There's a love and a power that can give us courage. Step on the storms. Step on the storms. Step on the storms. Amen.